If all your friends were jumping off a bridge, would you? Probably not, because hopefully you're not an idiot. Now, how about if you were walking down the street and you saw everybody looking up at the sky or at a building? Would you stop and look? You probably would. You'd probably want to know what they were looking at or what was going on. This is an example of social proof, and it's a powerful way in which we decide what to do and how to do it. Basically, social proof, well, we use evidence in our social circumstances as a metric of what we should do, how we should act, and what we should think. This is called social proof, and today on Brain Hacks, we're going to talk about social proof. Now, the driving force behind social proof is actually an innate need for most people to not want to think too much. Well, it's not only about thinking, it's more about a need to simplify the world. The world is a complicated place, and it can become overwhelming to have to make decisions about every little thing. So what do? Instead, we look at what other people are doing and use that as a metric, as a standard in which we evaluate what we are doing ourselves. So it's actually a form of a mental shortcut, or also a heuristic. Now, what a heuristic is basically it's a simple rule of thumb for deciding, well, actually I should say deciding quickly what to do. And in this case, social proof is one of the most powerful forms of mental shortcuts or heuristics. So today we're going to talk about a couple of examples of social proof and how it. Now, the first experiment is pretty cool. It involves pain. In 1961, an experiment tested whether people feel more pain in the company of others or alone. Now, in this experiment, they had two rooms with two different participants. In the first room, a participant sat alone and received mild electrical shocks. And then they later tested his pain perception using a galvanic skin response, basically the reaction on his skin, and also his heartbeat. In the second experiment, they had the participant in the room with another person who was also receiving the mild electrical shocks. Now again, they tested the results, and the results were surprising. People actually felt less pain when in the company of others experiencing a similar painful stimulus. Now, this is a weird manifestation of social proof. The fact that we actually feel less pain when we know that another person is experiencing the same situation. It's actually comforting to know that other people are experiencing the same thing as us. Now, social proof also works in settings when we are trying to learn. In the school environment, or in a professional environment when we're trying to pick up a new skill, or even when we're trying to get over a phobia. So in a 1961 study by Alfred Bandura, this guy was one of the earlier educational psychology researchers. So what he did, Mr. Bandura did in this experiment, is he had a child, and this kid was terrified of dogs. Absolutely terrified, like could not be in the same room as a dog. And what he did was he had 2 to 3 other children come in the room who displayed no fear whatsoever, and they pet the dog in front of the fearful child. They pet the dog, they played with the dog, and what Bandura did was he watched and he saw that children who were actually initially scared of dogs, using this social proof of the other children, actually started slowly playing with the dogs and becoming more and more comfortable. So again, social proof also works in a setting when you're trying to learn something. Now, in another example that's a little bit closer to home, in a 2009 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, researchers tested fast food consumption with the amount of commercials, fast food commercials, viewed by families in the US. And the results were not that surprising. The results showed that people who watched more fast food commercials actually consumed more fast food. Now, this doesn't sound surprising, but what was surprising was their conclusions. And the conclusions were that watching the fast food ads made the idea more acceptable. The idea that people around you in your community are also consuming fast food, therefore making it a more acceptable practice, was the factor that scientists concluded actually encouraged people to consume more fast food. It's pretty amazing. Now, social proof also works in situations that are slightly dangerous as well. In a surprising study by Princeton University, social proof was tested, the effects of social proof was tested in an emergency situation. So, in this experiment they had 2 rooms. Now, in this room there was 1 participant and 3 Confederates. Confederates are scientists who were sort of in on the experiment. And they tested what would happen if there were people in a room who saw smoke coming under the door, potentially indicating a fire in the next room. So in the first room, none of the Confederates, the scientists, said anything. And the 1 participant was sort of left there also not saying anything. And he did not tell anybody about the smoke coming under the door. Now in the second room, just 1 other person reporting the smoke coming under the door made the participant much more likely to actually say something. So we see that social proof is actually a very powerful form of social compliance. When nobody's saying anything or doing anything, you don't want to be the first person to raise your hand and make mention of something that's potentially dangerous. Now, speaking of dangerous things, the last experiment we're going to talk about today is very surprising. So surprising that you might not actually even believe it. Studies have shown that media reports of suicides and homicides actually increase subsequent murders and suicides in the weeks after the report. This is crazy. And I didn't even believe it myself until I looked into the statistics behind it. And it's true. Reporting on a homicide, especially if it's a sensational one, or suicide, actually make it somehow more accessible. The idea becomes more tolerable in people's minds, and it becomes a viable option. One particularly poignant example of this is Marilyn Monroe's suicide. Now, statistically speaking, after Marilyn Monroe's suicide, there were 200 more suicides in the next month. So as we can see from the experiments, social proof is a powerful metric which we use to decide which actions to engage in and which to avoid. We use what other people do as a metric to decide what we should do. And just 2 points to clarify what we talked about today. Number 1, social proof is a form of a mental shortcut or heuristic, a basic rule of thumb that we use to decide what to do. And second, you can see social proof around you all the time, in your own life and other people's lives. We look to other people for guidance sometimes in our own lives when we don't want to think too much about what to do. So if you enjoyed this video, there's lots more. Just subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching today. Thank you.